But you still can't be the first. You'll see, like, very old guys, they have like two straps and two enormous cameras, and it does actually help because you can, like, you're obviously the photographer, if you've got, and this is a big problem with event stuff, if you have a phone and there's four people next to you, they also have camera phones. And then, like, half the people are looking at that phone and half the people are looking at that phone, and no one's looking at your phone. And you have these issues where you're like, you have to basically tell people to not use it. Wait for you to take your picture first, because you kind of want eye contact, and it's a group. And when people look over to look, if you have a big camera, they will actually look at the camera. So, and I find issues with phones, they're very good, they're full of distractions. You'll be like, oh, I'm talking about a message. Oh, it's gone. Right? This kind of stuff. One of the benefits of film photography is that you don't have the distractions. You can't be plugged into the internet, and you're slowing down a bit. You're also limited to frames. But I'm not sure, I used to recommend an old film camera to people, but because of the price of film and the price of scanning, it's kind of prohibitive. Even 5 years ago, you could pick up a film camera very cheap, compact. Now they're kind of hipster, and they're harder to get, and they're more expensive. So you're a bit more selective about what you shoot. I think, as an approach to improving your photography, I think right now, if I'm starting off and I don't have a big budget, but I would try and think in terms of project. Like, I have what I have. Maybe I have a bit of spare money to buy a second-hand DSLR with a 50mm lens or something. I'm just saying that to somebody. Or like, I'm a big believer in second-hand stuff. You're managing it, or you might get something that doesn't work very well. This 60, I've shot all the weddings on it, and second-hand, it's like 10, 12 years old now. To be honest, I shouldn't do weddings with it because I should have two cameras. Because if I drop that in the middle of the wedding, I don't use straps. Straps are another, I've caused more incidents with straps, about the same. So if you have a strap in the camera, you can catch the strap. And I've done this, like the strap's hanging over the table, someone walks back, hits the strap, the camera goes flying. What I tend to use is a shoulder bag. So again, like I got a shoulder bag, and I tend to have the camera buried in the bag, but no strap. And it's just grab, shoot, put it back, and then swing this around, which is my preference, but some people do not like just, the first thing I do when I get a camera is normally take off the strap. I've left it on this one. Is this camera, if you ever see these cameras online, it's very funny. Try and find them without a dent in the corners. It's very hard. They're, I don't know, for some reason they're unholdable. Like you seem to just drop it. So you can get this strap. You can look on eBay for them, and ones without dents are pretty rare. I dropped this in Salt Hill, and it doesn't go to the slow shutter speeds anymore. It just seems to, it's a very odd camera because the controls are on the bottom, half of them, and it's reversed, so everything is backwards. But it's also an amazing camera for learning because shutter speed is here, aperture is here, focus is here, viewfinder is here, and nothing else. It's like, there's no other dials, and you can actually, this is the exposure triangle right there, like this, and you have an ISO, so it's these two settings and the focus, and you're just looking, and you set it, and then you lift it up. It's very minimal, which can be great. I was showing one of the range monitor style camera, which is the settings of the lens, which is a very good focusing system. If any of you heard of Leica, it's a very expensive brand called Leica. They're famous. The French photographer I mentioned, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Leica user M3 or something, they're like 5,000 euro each or something, the M60s. Very sharp. They use this kind of focusing system where you have an overlay. It's like you see two versions of the square, see two versions of something, and you put them over each other to focus. So they're there, you twist it all, now they're there, now it's in focus, now they're out of focus. And it can be very quick to get the focus. For this camera, this particular camera has no focusing system other than looking at the distance. So but it's actually very useful sometimes because I was saying it to you, like you have an infinity symbol. So if you put your camera to f11, it's nice and bright, and you put the infinity symbol under the f11, everything from infinity to about like 3 meters away is going to be in focus. And it's going to be very exact. It's not going to hunt around for a focusing thing. This is much quicker than like any autofocus camera for taking a shot. It's just, you just twist and then it's just done. But you have to have it set up beforehand. I might go to the exposure kind of idea. The exposure triangle is more you have just the ISO, which is the sensitivity originally of film, but what they do in photography is they have the same standards applying to different mediums. So you still use ISO, the same numbers in digital. That was because of film. And most of the standards in photography are based around this format. Like, if you look up the new iPhone lens, it will say it's like a 16mm lens. But it actually is much, much smaller than it's just the equivalent in this format. So this is the traditional like rectangular 16 by 9 or 3 by 2 format, rectangular. It's the oldest continuous format, so you can get cameras from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and this is what you call full frame digital sensors. And then you tend to use that as a reference point for the other ones. So if you say like your iPhone is a 16mm, that's a very wide lens. Whereas the actual, if you measure the actual distance between the focal plane and the lens in the iPhone, it's probably something like that, or even, I don't even know how small they are, it might be that. They're tiny, the sensors are tiny, but they tell you this stuff. It's like standards. The same with ISO, you tend to have like the slowest is generally 100, and then you go up to 200. And the settings in all of these, the ISO, can you remember what the other two colors would be? Aperture,
shutter speed.
Yes, shutter speed. And then this one is your shutter. Now, if you look at most pro cameras, they'll have a main dial of modes. And if you're serious about photography, you tend to ignore everything except the MAST ones. And even that one you don't really use that often. So this is actually often a T. Is it a T or an S? This is the shutter speed. This is the aperture and this is manual. You know, on your cameras you often have modes to show like a landscape, to show a mountain, or to show a person's face, and it's a portrait mode. They're automatic modes. If you want to learn more about cameras, ideally you're using this one, which is fully manual, but to be honest, my DSLR for the weddings and stuff, almost always using the AV mode, which is the aperture priority mode, or the shutter speed TV mode. I'm nearly always, they're automatically exposing, but you're fixing this or fixing this. And so you fix this, you say, I want f8, and it chooses the shutter speed. So you tend to fix that at the beginning, or based on lighting conditions. So this might go up to, film tends to peak at around 1600. It's hard to get more than 1600, but digital sensors are not so. Has anyone got a very new camera? The very new ones, they're very, very, very good at low light stuff, so they go up to like, I don't know, 32,000 or 64,000. So this is more sensitive, you can shoot in less and less and less light. Each one of these is a stop, and each one is doubling of sensitivity. 200 is twice as sensitive as 100, so you need half the amount of light to get the same exposure. So you're working in stops all the time, and these stops are all equivalent. So the shutter speed, you tend to start off with the B setting, which is you open it, this is ready for the low exposures, open it, walk away, come back 5 minutes and close it. It's just, the most basic camera is you open it and then you choose when to close it. You might have a watch. This is like a bulb setting. You use the cable release. You'll have them on your DSLRs as well. Just open it, walk away, come back. Then you tend to start off about 1 second, then half a second, and then it goes quarter of a second. You end up with this tends to be, for most physical shutters break down 1/8,000 of a second. You can have like, oh, this one it's half of this. Yes, and a lot of my 6D will peak at this. If you get 5D, which is the next one above, it goes a little bit faster. This will let in half the amount of light. This, and this will freeze everything, completely freeze everything. This, it's just, you open it and you're just getting blurred. Whee! There's no sense of like you freezing anything. If you put it on a tripod, you can freeze the things that don't move, which is what I do with the long exposures. And then you have, around here, you have somewhere where you're balancing blur and freeze, right? So it does change based on the length of your lens. So has anybody used binoculars?
Yeah.
Right? So if you're using binoculars and you're looking at something that's very shaky, like you have to be pretty, and the longer length of binoculars, so if you use, like if you go to buy a pair of binoculars, you might want one with the maximum magnification, but they're normally no good because it's like you're seeing a tiny thing and all it's doing is wobbling around because it's like zooming in on the movement. One tiny little change to so the longer the length, the faster the shutter speed you need to freeze things, and it tends to be 1 over the focal length. So if you were using a 50mm lens, you can hold 150. A lot of modern cameras have gyroscopic internal lens elements that actually balance it out. So they cancel out your movement, and you get 1 or 2 stops extra of foldability. Some systems have the lens in the body. Does anybody use a very modern new camera? Every year they get better. So some of them, you know the way drones now have gyroscopic movement. This is level and everything else is moving. Same idea in lenses where you have an element that is actually balancing out your movement. And you're able to shoot, like instead of 1/50th, you might be able to shoot 1/4 without blurring stuff. But then you might also want blur for creative purposes. Remember I showed you the one from the 1950s in the dance hall, amazing photograph, slow shutter speed on purpose because you want blur. So if you do have like a camera that you can set those things in, this is great fun to experiment with. Some people have shutter speeds they like to use, and they'll use this mode, and they'll go around setting the shutter speed, and it updates the aperture. Generally, you set one of these, and the other one is automatically updated for these. If you use manual mode, you choose both, and then the camera doesn't meter at all. It doesn't adjust anything. So with phones, this is kind of invisible. You have like a portrait mode in the phone normally, and it gives you this thing. Does anyone know who this is?
Where you build the background.
Yes, the blurriness of the background. You can get very pretty blurs where things kind of form circular blur patterns. You see in a lot of portraiture. Your phone can do this, but it's doing it algorithmically as opposed to optically. If you're using a normal, regular camera, to get this effect is when you're playing with the aperture. You want to make it as small as possible, which is actually, this number is small, but the actual opening is big. It's kind of the opposite, right? So you tend to go from f22. These numbers are a bit weirder in that they don't seem to add up. There's a little mathematical formula that relates them to, it's like the size of the element to the focal length of the lens, and you end up with these numbers. What it means is they're the same on every lens. It's like standard. So f16 is always the same amount of light for that lens. So f16 on any lens is going to be the same amount of light. And then this is how big your iris is. So this is your iris, right? It's like if you shine a light into it, what happens if I shine a light right into this? What happens to my iris? Does it grow or shrink? It shrinks. So which direction would it be going here? Which is bigger numbers or smaller numbers? Bigger numbers. So it's going to jump down to f22. This does interesting stuff. The big thing it changes is this. So it lets in a lot less light, which means you need a longer shutter speed to get an exposure. if you want like a normal exposure. And this increases the depth of field, which is how much of stuff is in focus. So the bokeh comes from using a wide open lens, or close to wide open. It might be f2, f1.8. And the front of every lens that you see will have the maximum aperture written on it. So who got the film camera? It had like f1.8, I think it was on it. It'll just tell you, and even if you look at the iPhones, it'll tell you how much it's able to let in. The brightest lens, I think, there's actually a Noctilux 0.9, which I mean, they're just like huge pieces of glass. I don't like these. I don't use these because they tend to be a little bit soft, and this depth of field, it gets razor thin. Especially with film, it's like, if I want to photograph you at f1.4 from about here, and the focusing distance is probably about that much. And if I'm a tiny bit off, I'm going to focus behind your head or in front of your face, and it's very hard to get accurate focus with it. Also, lenses tend to not be super sharp at their maximum opening. So optically, lenses tend to be best around the middle, sharpest, but then for portraits, to put the background of focus, you want this to be smaller, and it just focuses on like one piece. I think it's really interesting as well. This exists with our eyes, but again, it's like the software in our minds takes it all out. When you like hold your finger up, it's hard to see the blurry background. Like, if you take a photograph of my finger with f1.4 and I print it, I'll see this blurriness. I'll be able to focus on the blurriness. But with our eyes, whatever we focus on is focused, so it's not blurry. So it's hard to see. I think our eyes are about f1 or something, but our attention span, so the mind removes the stuff which is looking what we're looking at, and it's very hard to see what's out of focus. But you will find that on a bright day you're actually seeing more of the focus when your iris shrinks down. In the dark, you're looking at night vision stuff, stars. You will like your iris get huge. And it takes about 20 minutes for them to let in the most amount of light, and then gradually the stars will start to appear. Like you've done in the night viewing in front of ours somewhere. Night skies are great. It's quite cool. Like if you look at your phone in the middle of it, and then it takes 5 minutes again to be able to see the stars. And photographing that stuff is interesting. Photographing the moon is a great one for learning how our eyes are amazing. Like if you want to see how amazing our eyes are, it's like look at the moon and then try photographing them. Most good moon photographs are complicated photographs and sticking them together, or at least two, because the cameras can't handle the difference between the brightness of the moon and the blackness of the sky. There's too much contrast in it. So it will either try to make the moon too bright or the moon too dark. And it can't, but our eyes can see them both at once. When we look at the moon, we can see the details of the moon and also the sky details in the landscape. Most cameras can't do that. I don't think any of them can. So they tend to take two photographs and stick them together. Or you can just let the moon be white. I take moon photographs and I just let the moon be, we call it like a clipping or something, it's pure white. If you print it, there's no detail in it. A lot of photographers always try to, they say like a good photographer have detail in everything, detail in the shadows and detail in the highlights. Does anybody use Lightroom? So you're kind of editing, there's like a range, dynamic range, and then you want the darks to be dark, the bright to be bright, and you want the details in it. So if you have a moon and the background, and you want to be able to see the man in the moon, you have to pull back the whites, but then everything else is too dark. And then you're trying to get the landscape behind kind of visible, and then the moon disappears again. It's difficult to do it. But I've already gone. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
The core idea is this ISO, sensitivity medium, film or digital sensor, shutter speed, which is stop, half light, half light. This is half the sensitivity, half the sensitivity, or the other way around. Higher ISOs tend to be more noise. So in general, you want to use the lowest one you can use, and sometimes you need to use a low one because it's bright, and you want one of these near the maximum because you want to set it low. If you want a portrait, you want to shoot it at 2. That means you want your ISO really low, and you want your shutter speed really high.
But what you do is, you put your camera to AV, you put your ISO to 100, which is the lowest, and it's normally the best quality. And then you put this onto, and it will figure out the shutter speed to give you a metering based on its metering system. So there's this, and then there's a metering system that's actually automatically setting one thing. This sets nothing. This will fix this. You choose the aperture, and then it chooses the shutter speed for you. Or else you choose the shutter speed, and it chooses the aperture. This is the most popular, I think, and almost all pro systems will use this. For really creative stuff, you can use this. For the Hasselblad manual cameras, there is only this setting. There's nothing else. You're just, the pure old school cameras, you're changing these manually. There's no dial that automatically choose. There's no meter, carrier meter. The phone, you can get a metering app for your phone if you're using it. They're great. They will just measure the scene, but it's the same thing. It will show you choose one of these, which you use. Film can be very forgiving, depending on the kind of film you use. Does anybody use slide film?
Slide film.
Slide film, yeah. Positive film, it's not used very much now. If you look at old National Geographics, they have amazing colors. They're using a film called slide or positive film, reversal film. They were notorious for being very fussy about exposure. So if you were supposed to use like F16, would you use F11 and almost be white? Or if you go the other way and use F22, almost be dark, because your sensitivity is very fussy. It's like you have to be bang on exposure, and it immediately disappears. And like it goes too white, too dark. Whereas most negative film is actually more. It has a bigger range than digital sensors in general. So negative film is actually still better than most sensors for capturing more detail, a range of detail. So there's a film I use called HP5, it's an ultra film. I can kind of just wing it. I can go, it's bright, I'll use F16. It'll still give me some detail in the shadows and highlights, and it's still fine. There's this idea called Sunny 16. Sunny 16. If you've got no meter in manual camera, and it's just good to know in general, you can still expose pretty close. And the idea is, if it's a sunny day, so blue sky, lots of sun, this is the same one. Sunny, it's the same one. What you do is, you make 1 over the F16, right? So if you're shooting at ISO 100, 1 over 125, and F16 will give you a correct exposure. Does that make sense? If you change this to your ISO to be, let's say 400, which is a popular ISO, you probably go to 250 or 500. So 500 at F16 will give you the same exposure for a different ISO. And then what happens is, you look at the light and you say, is it sunny? And it's not sunny because it's going. So then you go, okay, how unsunny is it? So this is your reference point. You set this and you go, actually, it's not that sunny. It's kind of getting cloudy. I might make it F11, but it's still pretty sunny. And you go, actually, it's pretty cloudy. I'll go to this maybe. And you've gone from 16, 11, 8, 5, 6, which is double. It's like 2 by 2 by 2, 8. Right? 8 becomes less light needed to expose for. And this is overcast. So it's now overcast. But you can actually use this to photograph a lot of time. Where it breaks down is in evenings, where light can actually half like in 10 minutes in the evening, but you don't, again, our eyes are adjusting automatically, we don't see it. So during the afternoons and stuff, it's very good. It goes behind it, sun goes behind a cloud, you go from 16 to 8 or 11, and then comes out again, you go to 16. In the evening time, the light is dropping all the time, and our eyes are adjusting, but it's hard, it's much harder to do it. You tend to be like way further out with your guesses, because the light is always changing, and every 2 minutes you have to change it again. But I still will guesstimate stuff all the time with the different cameras. Then there was the general. So does this make sense? This could be. These all have YouTube videos and stuff as well. YouTube is great for picking up stuff as you go along. And again, like I don't know what stuff is best to try and like go through. I'm not even that technically aware of.
You can start. I started yesterday. I was reading about Wikipedia pages for like this thing called Circle of Confusion.
Circle of confusion.
Yeah, there's a Wikipedia page for everything. It's very technical, but you don't need to know it really. It's like a painter knowing which compounds were used to make the color of paint, kind of. If you're interested in photography, you need to know how it affects what you're doing, as opposed to, oh, here's the math formula for what happens. But there are math formulas. So this depth of field is affected by, for example, the sensor size. That's why the sensor on an iPhone is like this big. It's very hard to get this on an iPhone because the sensor is tiny, and the depth of field, because of the math formula, because of how the circle of confusion thing works, it basically everything's in focus, like most of the time. If it's anyways bright with an iPhone, changing this doesn't do that much because it's always using an aperture where most stuff stays in focus anyways, right? But if you have a big sensor, like the big Hasselblad camera, the film is the sensor. If I shoot it at f2.8, it's very hard to focus accurately enough that things are in focus because it's like this wide, the depth of field, because the sensor is bigger, right? So there's a relationship between the depth of field, the subject distance. If you go very close to something, the depth of field shrinks as well. Macro photography, where you're photographing things very close, insects and things like that. You actually don't take one picture, you take like 20 and stack them all together to get things to focus. So it's like a little bit like a moon idea that you're actual focusing like that much, even less, and then you just take a bunch at different focus points and combine them together. Because as you get closer, this thing just disappears. You're getting like it's shrinking down how much you focus. As you get further away, it gets much bigger. So if I have the same, if I have here, it will have your head and like 2 feet each side of you, maybe in focus. But if I switched over here, it will suddenly shrink down that much. If I went to my thumb, it would be like burying my thumb, wouldn't focus on it. I don't know, is that useful for generalists? I think like generally for so like the reality of where you're at, there's an infinity of stuff to learn. I think whatever gets you to the next photograph that you find interesting is what you follow. So I think in general it's like maybe try and come up with some kind of a project that is based on your life, your current circumstances, and your equipment. And it can be a phone, it can be whatever you want. And if there's a lot you can do with like a phone, like compositionally wise, you can focus on that. You can say, I don't care about the technical stuff, I don't have the dials. You can still do an interesting project. Like it could be like, try to come up with a title for it maybe. Doesn't matter, like mornings in like Highfield Park, if that's where you happen to live, or something like that. I did a series of, a DIY book based on my commute to the office. It's quite dark work, and I didn't realize it was dark work until like well after I met it. I showed it to someone else, like this is very bleak. And I had one camera, and I would leave it in the car, and I had it manually focused, and I would just, while I was driving, just take it up and randomly take a picture each day on the commute at a random point, and I ended up with like 36 commutes, and then I was pasting in like some news reports and like some random diary entries, and it was this weird diary project, and I was trying to also look at like the deadness of commuting. It's like this invisible parametric deadness going around 8 feet, and I was trying to relate that to like kind of banal random photographs. You're not trying to make them interesting, but then as a project, it will be interesting. And like anything about like what makes your life interesting to you, I know, or like maybe your friends group, or trying to say, oh, I can try and capture something about people you live with, maybe not like it. Your own, you can be your own best subject sometimes because you have access rights to yourself. Like the whole
permissions, it is blind, but you can't just photograph everything willy-nilly really without a conversation about whether it's ethical to hold open. I don't really, I have this issue with my folks. I take quite a lot of pictures of them, and I'm not sure like if it's okay. They don't seem to mind. And like, a lot of it is about what you use it for. Like, I don't really post pictures of them, and I haven't really posted them. But I think it's inspired a couple in Ireland to have their adult sons still living with them, and it's also kind of reflective of where we're at as a society. I've got, like, there's one picture that a friend of my man making a cake. It's a nice photograph. I'd like to submit it to some show or something, but I don't know if a man would like to see it in the show. Do I ask her? Do I go, no, it's art, I can do what I want? There's a lot of different energies, but you can always photograph yourself and your own life at different distances. And then this could be an interesting thing to do over a semester. What happens generally with semesterized college stuff is like I have this with my research because I was doing student support work. This is my this is the semester in weeks, and you're waiting on, and this is my like motivation for art. And I'm like, oh great, yes, mighty, oh no, oh god, assignments, oh dear, oh. And then your camera is sitting in the cupboard for a month towards the end. But if you find this reasonably straightforward kind of project and stuff, you can kind of be like, you'll have peaks and troughs, but you might be, oh, that's okay, and you might end up with like, and even if you're not interested, if you do this, like lapse of this, you will become, I don't even like to call it better, you become more mature as a seer of the world, which I think can be useful. It's also it's also can be there's a cost to being. It's like a cost to being a sensitive person. It's like this. Here's what this is, and then this is the way I look at it. Or cynicism, the curiosity, I suppose. It's like looking at. If you photograph a lot of landscape photography is kind of difficulty with looking at environmental degradation. It's just a challenge. If you don't photograph landscape, whereas if you're focusing on it, you're like, you get to enjoy the beach, and you're like, look on. So you're kind of always balancing this kind of stuff. But this is where a lot of art comes from, in general, and a lot of interesting stuff. So if you could, I think this would be useful. If you scrap all the technical stuff, you don't have to find a kid, you could find some project, and then maybe like the society runs different things and like use it as a social outlet. I think this society is quite interesting. You tend to get a cool international feel to it, which is quite interesting. I find it interesting that you don't get that. Anybody here from Galway? Which is this good or bad? I wonder why. This was the same when I was an undergrad, so I didn't do much with society.
I think it's good that we have loads of international students. So when we do like exhibitions or stuff, there's like a wide variety of art coming in. It's nice to see.
Yeah, it's just great. They're difficult.
Yeah.
Even the frame, I let some pieces in to be framed
We
today.
did more of like a laid back exhibition rather than film.
Sure. Yeah.
We're thinking of maybe like more additional, like an e-bang or something.
Sure. Yeah, it could be worth having a group.
Yeah, it might just do that theme.
Which is the same idea, it's more of a social project.
Submit.
I do think like the current housing situation, I have this idea of a project where everyone, you have a group of different people of different circles and everybody photographs the living quarters and like they're in this space and you might be completely anonymous, not say who's living where, and then like have some sort of digital show which is that stuff. Sometimes really boring subjects can be good project subjects. Like the idea of photographing sunsets. It's like who has not photographed sunset? Not photographed. They're beautiful. Like they're just
well, like it's this idea of this is like a big part of, and it's fine. It's fine. Like this might be what we want to look for. It's like wow, but it might not make a good art project exactly, because how many photographs of sunsets have we seen? It's difficult to escape this thing. That's like they're kind of linked. So many pictures of sunsets. How do you make a picture of a sunset that someone will go, wow, ooh, it's interesting on another level? It's not easy. You can do, stuff can be done. And at the beginning I was talking about like the famous photographer who has photographed like, empty landscapes. It's just kind of like trying to find a topic that hasn't really been explored that much, but then it might not be interesting to that many people. I gifted my aunt a photograph a few years ago, and I loved the picture, and she didn't hang it up. It was like a bougie black and white picture, and then she came back not that long ago and asked me to print a colour picture of a rainbow. And it's a nice photograph. You can't really win. You can never please everybody, and if this is interesting to you, go for it. Like it's great. It can still there's still good things having a camera. For example, I said you can technically say that you're never lost. You can just wander places and just go. I'm just here to look at stuff. It can also help you improve how you see things. Just like seeing things around you. Like there's a link between noticing stuff and. For example, I'm now better at noticing the type of birds that I see, right? Or noticing, like, if I'm in Connemara, I can normally name the mountains depending on where I am. I can say, oh, I know that mountain because I know it's shaped like that and I was there last week or last year photographing. And you get this sense of orientation within your space, which is something you can do as well. Like, you can, like, I know a lot of people who, I'm from the area more or less. But I've invested quite a lot of time in the geography of it. I want to zoom down into all the locations are here, and I see all of the locations in the film. It can give you an extra layer, but then it also can make it hard to watch. Like, well, they jumped from 2 islands, and like that isn't the same place at all. But it's interesting stuff, and the landscape here is cool. Like there's still like an otherness to some of it if you can't get out to do trips and things like that. But I wouldn't. Ideally, you don't get too caught up in. You see, I think it's. I was still always trying to photograph rainbows, and I went through this phase where it's like when I see a rainbow, I will try to imagine I've never seen one before, and which is like you get this wow factor, which is great. But it's still harder to not have it as a cliche. But still, I have some photographs of rainbows that are beautiful. That's like an angry cloud, a rainbow, and then the view from old inspired hills and stuff. So there's a whole, it's a huge space. Again, this and potentially a book or two. Then we use it in like the theory, the philosophical side of photography. Susan Sontag